Welcome back to another video on Daniel. Today, we're going to be venturing into chapter 12. Let's get straight into it. So in verse 1, we read, "At that time, Michael, the great prince, the protector of your people, shall arise. There shall be a time of anguish such as never occurred since nations first came into existence. But at that time, your people shall be delivered, everyone who's found written in the book." End quote. Okay, there can be no doubt here that Daniel is describing the apocalypse, the end of the world. God is now intervening in the last moments of human history. And the reason we can be so sure of this is the fact that the archangel Michael is breaking into the story. We literally have an angel coming into history itself. Now, the question is, when exactly is this going to occur? Well, the text tells us that it occurs, quote, "at that time." Well, when exactly is that referring to? Well, this is where we have to realize that the chapter division between chapter 11 and chapter 12 in the book of Daniel is totally artificial. It really shouldn't be there at all. So we're going to bring up the last few verses of chapter 11, and we're just going to see them all as a totality here, because this is how we should really view it. We're not going to read the whole thing again, but it's really important for you to know that we should read this straight through. Don't stop at chapter 12 and think something totally new is happening. It's not. It's following straight on. Okay, well, back in verse 40 of chapter 11, we're told at the time of the end. So the reference to "at that time" is referring back to that exact phrase in verse 40. Which tells us that we're dealing with the end of time. In other words, the apocalypse. All right, let's keep on reading verse 40 here. It says, "At the time of the end, the king of the south shall attack him," end quote. So this is referring to the 7th Syrian War, which hopefully you remember never actually took place. Can I then direct your attention down to verse 45 here, which says that he, Antiochus IV, shall pitch his palatial tents between the sea and the beautiful holy mountain, yet he shall come to his end with no one to help him, end quote. So this is referring to the death of Antiochus IV, and he dies in Israel according to the book of Daniel, which again, hopefully you remember, didn't actually occur. But hopefully now you can see what's happening. What we have is the 7th Syrian War, Antiochus IV dies, and then at that time, Michael, the great prince, will present himself. So in other words, this is the timeline that Daniel is providing us. First, we have the 7th Syrian War, then Antiochus dies, and then Michael appears. This is the timeline that we should all be visualizing when we're reading Daniel chapter 11 and 12. And the reason why we can't avoid this conclusion is because in verse 1 of chapter 12, we are told that Michael appears at that time. He's not referring to something in the far distant future. He's talking about the events that he's witnessing in his day. As Golden Gate writes, "At that time," the phrase again indicates continuity with what precedes and excludes the idea that the seer is moving to some far future moment, end quote. This is really important because many modern interpreters are going to want to push these events of Michael appearing to the far distant future, distant from us. This is something that's going to happen at the end of time from our perspective. That's not what Daniel is saying. Daniel is saying that the end of the world is going to happen soon after the death of Antiochus. Again, we'll talk more about that soon, but that should cause us some alarm. Let's now read what Hartman writes. He says, in 12:1, the twice repeated phrase, "at that time," though it is one of the usual eschatological phrases, refers to the time of the miserable death of Antiochus IV, and not to some distant time in the future. He continues, "To be sure, the sacred author most likely was of the opinion that the definitive intervention of God would take place when Antiochus had received his due recompense," end quote. Again, Hartman is telling us that Daniel believes that God is going to intervene in history in the 2nd century BC. Let's now keep on reading verse 1 and break this down a little bit more. So we have the archangel Michael coming onto the scene. So it reads, "At that time, Michael, the great prince, the protector of your people, shall arise. There shall be a time of anguish such as never occurred since nations first came into existence." So here we have a reference to a time of anguish such as never been experienced before. Again, this is apocalyptic language. We then continue, "But at that time your people shall be delivered, everyone who is found written in the book." So here we have a judgment day scenario where we have books being opened and people being judged. Again, it's unavoidable that what we have here is a description of the end of the world. Now, just in case you're still not convinced, let's now go on to verse 2, which reads, quote, "Many of those who sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake, some to everlasting life, and some to shame and everlasting contempt. Those who are wise shall shine like the brightness of the sky, and those who lead many to righteousness, like the stars forever and ever," end quote. So here we have the resurrection of the dead. Again, there is no avoiding the conclusion that Daniel here is describing the end of the world. There is no avoiding that conclusion. But this now does present us with a big problem, and that is that Daniel believes the end of the world will happen in the 2nd century BC. So in other words, if we were to bring up a timeline here for a moment, what Daniel is saying is that the resurrection of the dead will occur in about 160 BC after the death of Antiochus IV. So the apocalypse is going to happen here. Now, the reason why this is such a big problem is because the apocalypse didn't happen there. History continued as usual. We have Jesus appearing in the year 0, and then here we are all the way down at 2000 AD, and we're all still here. The end has not happened. So if we do take an objective lens to this, it does seem that Daniel has made a mistake. As Hartman writes in his book, quote, "To be sure, the sacred author most likely was of the opinion that the definitive intervention of God would take place when Antiochus had received his due recompense." So in other words, Daniel believed that God was going to intervene in history in 160 BC, which of course did not happen. So to put it simply, Daniel believed the apocalypse was going to happen here in about 160 BC. Now, I know that for many of my viewers, this is going to be a little bit controversial. So let's just discuss it in the comment section below. Leave your thoughts. Let's have a chat. If you've enjoyed this video, please consider becoming a patron. Click the link in the description below and you can become a patron today. If you do so, you are going to receive additional content. For example, I'm going to extend this video a bit longer for patrons, and we're going to talk about 2 things. The first of which is this incorrect view that many people have, which is that the Antichrist is gay. And they actually get that from a misreading of Daniel 11. So we're going to be breaking that down. It's going to be really fascinating to show how this is incorrect. And we're also going to be looking at the way that Martin Luther broke down this view as well. So very interesting stuff, only for patrons. So please consider becoming a patron. If you're not in a position to give, can I please encourage you to click that like button, leave a comment, and subscribe. If you do these things, it really does help the channel to grow. Thank you for watching until the end, and I'll see you in the next one. All right, now that everyone's gone and it's just me and my patrons, let's now talk about these 2 things that I brought up. And that is this belief that the Antichrist is gay, and also Luther. If you haven't read Luther before, you're in for a real treat. He's an absolute firecracker when he writes. But let's first talk about this idea that the Antichrist is gay. So in the book of Daniel, chapter 11, we can break it up into these 3 major sections. We've got verses 3 to 35, which is historically accurate account of the Syrian wars. Then in verse 36 to 39, we have a description of, now it should be Antiochus IV. That is the correct view of it. This is a description of Antiochus IV. And then verses 40 to 45, we have the end of the world. Now, this orange section, verses 36 to 39. For most of church history, people have actually misunderstood this. And they believe that verses 36 to 39 doesn't describe Antiochus. Rather, it's describing the Antichrist, who is this end of world figure, someone who appears at the end of time. So they believe that verses 36 to 39 is actually describing the Antichrist. Not only do they have this incorrect view, but also for most of church history, people have been mistranslating verse 36 to 39. So let's now look at the King James Bible, which has this very poor translation of verses 36 to 39. And remember, when we read it, when it says the king in these verses, people believe that this is referring to the Antichrist. All right. And the king shall do according to his will, and he shall exalt himself and magnify himself above every god, and shall speak marvelous things against the God of gods, and shall prosper till the indignation be accomplished, for that is determined shall be done. We continue in verse 37. Neither shall he regard the God of his fathers, nor the desire of women, nor regard any god, for he shall magnify himself above all. End quote. Hopefully you can spot the very poor translation here. It's the part that says that the Antichrist is not going to desire women. Okay, first things first. This is not referring to the Antichrist. This is referring to Antiochus. Second of all, this is a bad translation of verse 37. Let's look at the New Revised Standard Version, which translates the same verse 37 as, he shall pay no respect to the gods of his ancestors or to the one beloved by women. All right. Now, what this actually means, with the proper understanding and the proper translation, is that Antiochus is not going to respect the God who is beloved by women. Read it again, the NRSV here. He shall pay no respect to the God of his ancestors or to the one beloved by women. So the God who was beloved by women is here Adonis. Adonis was loved by women. So Antiochus is going to pay no respect to Adonis, the god who was beloved by women. It's not saying that Antiochus doesn't like women. But as you can see, the King James Version mistranslates this and says that the Antichrist doesn't like women. And therefore, that must mean that the Antichrist is gay. And just in case you're thinking, well, you're just totally making this up, no one believes this, let me now show you that lots of people believe this. Quote, The most obvious sign of the Antichrist is that he is gay, as the Bible says, Daniel 11:37. Neither shall he regard the God of his fathers, nor the desire of women, nor regard any god, for he shall magnify himself above all. In another book, we read, the Antichrist will be a nasty figure who will use everything at his disposal to highly blaspheme the name of God. His blasphemy will reach such a height that he will possibly be a homosexual, Daniel 11:37. Saying that he shall not regard the desire of women suggests that perhaps this wicked leader will also add homosexuality to his corrupt attributes, which is very abominable before God, being a relationship against the nature created by God. In this way, he would come as a gay Messiah to try to offend the Lord as much as he can. And then a more scholarly source here that kind of reflects on all of this writes, quote, in conservative Christian discourse, the Antichrist's probable homosexual orientation is derived from a particular way of translating Daniel 11:37. Some translations render the middle part of the verse as follows: he will show no regard for the God of his fathers or for the desire of women. So that's the New American Standard Bible. So that's on top of the King James. So other people have translated it in the same way. It's not just the King James here. The Antichrist's lack of interest in women allows for the suggestion that the Antichrist may be homosexual. All right, so there is the breakdown as to why so many people believe that the Antichrist is going to be gay. So it's wrong for two reasons. First of all, Daniel chapter 11:37 is about Antiochus, not the Antichrist. And also it's a mistranslation. It's saying that he does not respect the God who is beloved by women, not that he doesn't like women. All right, now we come to a related topic, and this is on Martin Luther. All right, Martin Luther, he's an absolutely interesting character, and hopefully you've read some of his writings before. If not, you're going to read them now. Now, Martin Luther obviously didn't read the King James Bible. The King James Bible, I believe, was like translated in 1611. Luther predates that. He lived before 1611, so he wasn't reading the King James Bible. But this mistranslation of verse 37 predates the King James Bible. It's obviously how some very old manuscripts in either Greek or Latin had translated things. And therefore, Luther is going to hold a similar belief that this Antichrist is not going to like women. So, the Antichrist does not like women, according to Luther as well. But guess what? Luther thinks the Antichrist is the Pope. So he kind of goes on this diatribe in which he says all these terrible things about the Pope, and it's really just quite interesting. All right, let's read what Luther writes here. Buckle in, Luther is a firecracker. He writes, a wife is a help to her husband. Rather, everyone scribbles and screeches about it, as we see and hear. On this point, the whole world must regard God as a liar. That is why even the Pope, in his canon law, has put God to school, stipulating therein that a wife is not a help, but a hindrance in serving God, and that therefore he who would serve God must not have a wife. And that is perfectly true, for the God whom the Pope serves cannot be served by the work of our God. Luther then continues to write in the next section. The prophet Daniel said this of the Pope a long time ago, stating in chapter 11, he will know nothing of married women, or he will give no heed to married women. So as you can see here, he's inserting the word married here as well. He's really butchering the translation. Nevertheless, this is what Luther thinks. He thinks it's referring to married women, and he's reading it as the Antichrist will have nothing to do with married women or won't like married women. And of course, he thinks the Antichrist is the Pope. To harlots, however, he was to give heed, and even worse, but whoever would be a true Christian must grant that this saying of God is true, and believe that God was not drunk when he spoke these words and instituted marriage. So that is Luther, and that is the view that the Antichrist is gay. So some very interesting stuff there. Hopefully you enjoyed it, and thank you again for being a patron. You make this channel possible, and I really do appreciate your support. It means the world. Thank you for watching until the end, and as always, I'll see you in the next one.